Hey, everybody. Today is about one word. It is the word imminency. It's a word that we don't use very often. It's not a very popular word, but it basically means the state or condition of being impending. It is the indication that something is liable to happen, especially something traumatic or evil or dangerous. When something is imminent, that means it is close. It's a word that is used often when we study biblical prophecy. The biblical prophets talked a lot about imminency. Now, they used a phrase that is the same thing. They didn't use the word imminency. They would use the phrase at hand. For example, John the Baptist, when he was preaching about the kingdom, he called people to repent because he said, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. That meant it was imminent. That meant it was close enough that you could touch it. It was not even an arm's length away. This was the language of the prophets. It was the concept that was woven throughout prophetic speech in the Bible. Have you ever met a prophet? Anybody met a prophet? You're saying, yeah, I met one down on 6th Street the other day. I mean, he was kind of disheveled and walking around and yelling out at the top of his lungs that the end was near, that time was up. I mean, I think that's how we think of prophets, don't we? We think of prophets as people who are proclaiming the end of time. They carry signs that say the end is near, and they forecast doom. We think of prophets as these annoying people who constantly are telling us that our time is up. But I would suggest that all of us have known in our lifetime a prophet, and maybe more than one. And perhaps all of us have known at least one prophet very well. That is, if you had a mother who was like my mother. Because my mother was a self-proclaimed prophet. Because she would prophesy over me all the time. She would say things like this: if you don't eat your vegetables, you will not grow up to be healthy. If you sit too close to the TV, you will go blind. She would say, if you would ever clean your room, I think I will have a heart attack and die. And then there was that great prophetic proclamation that my mother used regularly that warned me of future impending doom. She said, if you don't stop hitting your brother, I will hit you so hard, you will have no memory of the last week of your life. I think we're all familiar with prophetic speech. We use it all the time. We don't realize we're using it, but when we make predictions or we make calculations, when we make statements after the first 10 minutes of the Longhorn game, that this looks terrible. We are using prophetic speech. We are making proclamations about the future. You watch the news, you watch weather forecasts. Prophetic speech and the spirit of prophecy is part of our everyday experience. See, the spirit of prophecy has two components. There is the component that is familiar to us. It is the component of foretelling. This is the component of prophecy that says, this is what is in the future. I am foretelling what will happen. But there's also a part of the spirit of prophecy that is forthtelling. And this is when someone speaks about not things the way they are, but things the way things should be, the way things could be. The spirit of prophecy tells the truth, and basically says that this is what is wrong with the human condition or human behavior, and the consequences of these choices will lead to these results. That is forthtelling, truth-telling. And that's why, probably more than foretelling, it's the forthtelling aspect of the prophet's spirit that is so annoying, that makes prophets so unpopular. If you are a person who has a spirit of prophecy and you see things not as they are, but really as they should be, And you're like a person with perfect pitch. Everything that sounds like it doesn't make sense, you have to try and correct it. You are an annoying person. These are unpopular people. And the subject of prophecy can be an unpopular and confusing and difficult subject. I want to spend the next few weeks talking about biblical prophecy. And I want to look specifically at 3 unfulfilled prophetic promises. And today I want to begin with the first of those 3 promises, a difficult one for us to get our heads around. It's confusing and complex, but it is the promise of his return. But before we talk about that, would you pray with me? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your words spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to challenge us to live with a sense of urgency and imminency, that we might take every moment and take from it the fullness of it, and that we would not take this moment or tomorrow for granted. Pray that for myself and for my family and for everyone here, for I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. The theological word for the study of prophecy is eschatology. It comes from the Greek word eschaton, or eschatos. And the word eschatos means future things, so that eschatology is the study of future things, like biology is the study of natural things, geology is the study of geological things. Eschatology is the study of future things. And eschatology is the favorite playground of young theologians. It was for me and many of my peers, because eschatology is kind of like detective work. It's kind of like trying to figure out what is going to happen in the future. And the beauty of eschatology is nobody's wrong, because it hasn't happened yet. And you won't know if you're wrong until what you predict is going to happen either happens or doesn't happen. And the way I see it, by the time it happens, what you think is going to happen won't matter anyway. So eschatology becomes this fertile ground for speculation and theological navigation of very complex and difficult ideas and writings. You see, the prophet's eye view is a complicated thing. We have a tendency to think that the view of a prophet is simply a prediction of future things. But what eschatology teaches us is that the prophet's eye view is a prophet looking into the future. And what he is seeing is not just a single peak, but perhaps a number of peaks. And that what he is describing may be this, or it may be this, or it may be this, or it may be all 3. And we don't know what the distance is between these peaks, or even if there is one. Because the prophetic point of view, if he's standing and he's looking at these summits, kind of looks like this. And we don't know if there's a valley in between these places, or if this is just a ridge that is part of this peak. For example, when the Old Testament prophets were predicting the coming of the Messiah, they predicted him both as triumphant and a ruler who would establish the kingdom of heaven over all the earth. And they also predicted him as a suffering servant, as a powerful healer. What they didn't realize was that there was a 2,000-year gap in between the image of the suffering servant and the image of the triumphant servant. Same prophecy, 2 different fulfillments. In theological terms, this is called the archetype, and these are types of fulfillments of those prophecies. And when we read prophetic literature and we study prophecy, a lot of what is going on is mysterious to us. And it's supposed to be. The Apostle Paul called the church the great mystery because it was in this gap that none of the prophets predicted. They thought it was just one ridge into another, but they didn't realize right now, so far, it's been 2,000 years. What we often don't realize is that Jesus was the greatest of all prophets. He knew the beginning from the end, and his prophetic speech was some of the most complex and difficult predictions of all of the prophets in the entire Bible. And the largest section of Jesus' prophetic teaching is recorded for us in the Gospel according to Matthew in the 24th chapter. In Matthew chapter 24, it begins with Jesus in the final days of his life in Jerusalem. And he is walking through the temple courts, and he is making his way to the eastern gate. And as he is walking by the temple, he notices the temple, and he makes a prediction. He says, there will be a day when this temple will be torn down. Not one stone will be left standing on top of another. What he was talking about metaphorically was his crucifixion that was to come. That he was, in fact, the temple of the Holy Spirit, and that he would metaphorically be torn down and destroyed. But he was also talking about an event that would happen 27 years later. In 70 AD, 27 years after his death and resurrection, a Jewish rebellion would cause the Romans to come in and destroy Herod's temple, and it has never been rebuilt since. So he was talking about both his own destruction and the destruction of the physical temple. He was combining these two aspects into one prediction. It says that they walked out of the eastern gate and down through the Kidron Valley and up to the Mount of Olives to the east of the city of Jerusalem. And probably as they sat on the Mount of Olives, looking back across the valley into the temple of Jerusalem, his disciples asked him, when will this happen? When will this destruction of the temple take place? And two more questions. What will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus answers those questions. But what we have to understand in his answer is that he is answering about multiple pieces of time, multiple peaks, multiple summits throughout history. So as we read Matthew chapter 24 and what Jesus predicted about his coming, I want us to notice three things. And the first thing I want you to notice is in verses 4 to 14. This is what he says about his return. He says, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. For most of my life, I was taught that Matthew chapter 24 was talking about this event, the final event of his return. But I'm convinced what Jesus is talking about is he is talking about a series of events, the timing of which is uncertain. But the one thing we can be certain of is that he is saying that every generation between when he was speaking and when he returns is a terminal generation. What I mean by that is every generation is a generation in which he could return. The table is set. There's nothing else that needs to happen, and that has been true for 2,000 years, and it will be true until he comes. You see, in his day, the disciples looked around and they saw the deception of the world. They saw global deception, just like we do now. It was true then, and it is true now. He says, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. That's true today. That was true 2,000 years ago, and it will be true 2,000 years from now. Every generation experiences the same global conflict. He says, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. He talks about global catastrophes, and global catastrophes are part of our world, and they were part of their world. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. They're the sign that the world is ready. Global persecution has been a part of the culture of our globe for 2,000 years. You'll be handed over and persecuted and put to death. You'll be hated by all nations because of me. In the first century, they were fed to the lions and persecuted by the Romans. In our day, they're thrown in prisons in Iran and in Myanmar and in places around the world. Apostasy was part of their culture. It is a part of the world that we live in. Many will turn away from the faith. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. And the process of global evangelization has been going on since the very beginning. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. These things have always been and will always be. And the point is that there is nothing else that needs to happen in human history to prepare the world for his return. It is ready and waiting. Every generation is ready for his return. Every generation is a terminal generation. The second thing I want you to notice about his teaching in Matthew chapter 24 is that everyone will know him when they see him. His return will not be ambiguous. It will not be a question of, did he really come back or did he not come back? In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, there was a very popular theological doctrine that was championed by me and by many others. It's called the dispensational, premillennial, pre-tribulational doctrine of the rapture of the church. If you're not familiar with what the doctrine of the rapture of the church is, the doctrine of the rapture of the church basically says that there will be a day before which there will be no warning, about which there will be no indication prior to its event. There will be a day when suddenly, instantly, all of the true followers of Jesus will disappear from the face of the earth. This was such a popular doctrine in American evangelicalism that 16 books were written and became New York Times bestsellers. There were 4 major motion pictures that were made about the story that was called Left Behind. It is the story of the doctrine of the rapture of the church. And if you're unfamiliar with it, basically, it's an amazing motivational story that says that at any moment, without any pre-indication, that the true followers of Jesus will disappear from the earth. So that you could be flying in an airplane and all of a sudden the pilot and co-pilot disappear. Or you could be driving down the highway and all of a sudden hundreds of cars and their drivers and passengers, many of whom would disappear from their cars. You could be in a church like this on a Sunday morning and maybe 3 or 4 people would suddenly disappear. But the idea is so melodramatic and so powerful that I have a great deal of affection for this doctrine. In fact, this was the doctrine that was being preached when I made a decision to give my life to Christ. It was a message about the rapture. I had never heard anything like this, and I certainly didn't want to be left behind. Because the doctrine of the rapture of the church says that when the rapture of the church takes place, what is left on the earth is 7 years of hell. It is the Great Tribulation. And it's easy to figure out how that would work if all of a sudden millions, if not billions of people suddenly disappeared from the planet. The chaos that would be left would be the perfect environment for the rise of the person who the Bible describes as the Antichrist. And in the pre-tribulational doctrine, the premillennial pre-tribulational doctrine, the idea is that those who are left behind have to endure the worst suffering that has ever occurred in human history. Now, I not only have affection for this doctrine because it is what God used to bring me to a relationship with Him, I preached it to thousands and thousands of teenagers throughout the 80s and the 90s. And it was powerful stuff. I could bring a room of 1,000 teenagers to tears with the idea that even before we leave tonight, the person sitting next to you could be gone. That will preach all day long. That is a highly motivating thing, but you have to be very, very careful with it. Because of the prophet's eye view, because of the way that prophecy is laid out, it may be that this is what takes place, or it may be simply a ridge in the moments before His return. If you read Matthew chapter 24, this is what Jesus says about it. So if anyone tells you, there He is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here He is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. When He returns, everyone will know it. They'll know it when they see Him. His return will be literally astronomical. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and with great glory. This will not be a missable event. The return of Christ will be an event through which the whole world comes to know Him. Now, it could be that that is a different event than what He describes in verse 31. Because in verse 31 He says this, and He will send His angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather His elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. It could be that that takes place 7 years before the astronomical event. Could be. But either way, He doubles down and He says, make no mistake, when I come back, everyone will know it. It will be an unmissable event. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you will know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you will know that it is near, right at the door. It is imminent. It is at hand. Truly, I tell you, this generation, this terminal generation, will not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. He's saying there will be a day when I will return. And there is nothing that needs to happen prior to my return because every generation is ready. The world is ready. Every generation is a terminal generation. And when I return, everyone who sees me will know who I am. But the third thing I want you to notice about Matthew chapter 24 is the most important. This is the takeaway. What do we know about His return? We know this one thing, above all else, that every day could be the day. This day could be that day. Any day could be that day. Every day could be the day. That all of the signs, all of the predictions, all of the prophecies are in place to say that this day could be the day. This is how Jesus says it in Matthew chapter 24. He says, but about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage up to the day that Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a hand mill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. Keep watch, because my arrival is imminent. How do we live like that? How do we live our life with the idea that today could be the day, that this could be the last day? I mean, does that mean that we just go out and charge our credit cards to the limit and go, woohoo, I'm not going to be around to pay this off, I'm out of here? Does that mean that we look at the world that we live in and we say we're so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good? Does that mean that we don't press into environmental issues and try and leave the world a better place than we found it because we're not going to be around? Does that mean that we don't work for causes that bring justice? Does that mean that we don't care for the poor and the needy around us? Because we're on our way out. What does this matter? We're not going to be here. I don't have to make any plans for tomorrow. I don't know about you, but that doesn't work for me at all. Because I'm a planner. I'm a big planner. I mean, I plan out my life. I plan out everything I'm going to do next week. I plan out the weeks ahead. I plan out years in advance. I know the days when I'm going to be working out. I'm going to know the days that I'm going to be taking off. I know the meetings that I'm going to have. I know the messages I'm going to preach. I know what I'm preaching on at Christmas of 2019. I like planning. I like looking forward to things. I bought plane tickets to take my wife to Europe for our 40th wedding anniversary, which is at the end of May of next year. And I didn't even buy the insurance because I'm going. So what does it mean? How do we live with this sense of imminency that today could be the day, and yet live with the idea that we have a stewardship of our future and the future of the world that we live in? How do we do that? Well, let me suggest that we hold the future loosely and we hold every moment tightly. That all of our dreams and all of our hopes, all of our plans, all of our expectations of the future, that we hold them with an open hand. Because I don't know about you, but something that creates a great deal of stress in my life, a great deal of anxiety and worry in my life, are the unmet hopes, the unmet dreams, the unfulfilled expectations that I have about what is yet to come. Some of the things that I worry about probably will never happen. Some of the things that I hope for probably will never happen. And it is good emotional health for me to hold my future with an open hand. That doesn't mean ignore it. That doesn't mean abandon the causes that make the world a better place. That doesn't mean abandon the opportunities to be financially wise to prepare for my future. That simply means that I hold that with an open hand, but I do not take for granted right now that to the best of my ability, I am fully present with everyone that I come across, that I am fully present in every conversation, that I will squeeze the nectar out of life to the greatest of my ability, that I will always be thankful and I will always be generous, and I will love more deeply, and I will say thank you more frequently, and I will forgive more easily, that I will not take the now for granted. I think we live with a sense of urgency and imminency by holding the future loosely and holding the precious moments of this present day with great passion, with great presence, with great intensity. Jesus was answering a question that his disciples asked. They asked him, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming, and what will be the sign of the end of the age? And in Matthew chapter 24, he looks to the hills. And the things that I notice about that is he tells us that every generation is ready. Every generation is a terminal generation. And he tells us that everyone will know him when they see him. But most importantly, he looks to the future and he says, every day could be that day. Any day could be the day. He's looking with a prophet's eye view toward the future. He's looking at these peaks, and he doesn't distinguish for us how much time is in between or how much of a gap is in between each of these items. He just says, these are the things that will happen. Be ready. That's why the study of eschatology is so fascinating and confusing and difficult. Because we can't know the answer. But the beauty of eschatology is that we don't have to. We don't have to know the whens. We don't have to know the mysteries. We only know that the future is full of God's awareness. That spirit of prophecy, I think, is in all of us. I think we are all do some foretelling and some forthtelling. It is a practice that we all engage in. I mean, some of us more than others. It is that annoying observation when we point out what is wrong with people's behaviors or ideas. I'm convinced that the folks who determined to come and picket Riverbend last week, those whose names shall never be mentioned, were people who believe themselves to be prophets, who believe that it is their calling to foretell, to point out the sin and the evil in the culture and in people like us. That's why prophets are annoying and unpopular people. But their message has at its core a singular thing. It's what John the Baptist was saying. Repent, square your life away, because the kingdom of heaven is imminent. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is so close you can reach out and touch it. It is less than an arm's length away. And it is as true today as it was in John's day, that for each of us, the kingdom of heaven is in fact at hand. Because there is no promise that we will have tomorrow. There is no promise that this breath will not be our last, that the next beat of our heart will not be our final one. We have no such guarantees. And so that what John was saying, what every prophet was saying, is that the future is at hand. And the word that they use, the reminder to us of how to live our lives, is we are to live with imminency.